Hi there, my name is Raeann Fopma. I'm a senior BFA student, and this is a presentation on my thesis work called Subcreated. Right, so I am an overthinker. I thought for months and months prior to senior seminar about what my thesis work would be about and what culture-changing message I could share. Last year, as a junior, I thought I would make work that advocated for individuals with atypical learning needs, and last semester I thought I would make work about identity and self that helped give individuals who struggled with identity a sense of belonging and representation. I believed for the work that I created to be truly meaningful, it needed to have a purpose, and that purpose needed to benefit others somehow. After grappling with how to accomplish these daunting tasks that I'd set myself, and continuously running stuck, I decided to set aside these lofty expectations for what my work should do and look at the work and ideas that I had found exciting and generative in the past semester. That's how I came to make this body of work, which has become even closer to my heart than I think the bigger ideas ever could have been. So this work is all about finding unusual processes that help me experience nature in new ways and generate art in a way that parallels the art that exists in creation. It is a process-driven body of work that captures these unique interactions, and it leans heavily into the materiality of these artistic processes. Some of these processes included making plaster relief molds, collaging paper and fabric, embroidering photos, creating color gradients, scanning objects, embroidering objects to paper, and making paint pressings. All of these processes involved some element of nature, whether it be the leaf that I used to paint with, the rock I used to create shapes of fabric, or the flower that I was scanning. The initial draw to this work began with noticing human effect on environments and considering how the two collaborate. To visually communicate the visceral feeling of human manipulation of environments in the way that environments affect humans in return, I knew this work had to really press into the materiality of art, which meant straying from the fully digital work I had grown comfortable in. I first engaged with this idea of human manipulation on environments in my topics class, a studio course on art and ecology. I watched throughout the course of the semester as all of the work I was making grew more and more focused on the materials that I was using, and it all seemed to be colored by this idea of discovering unique ways that I interact with my world around me, especially documenting the interactions that I found most intimate and beautiful. For my very first project and topics last semester, I made a publication that documented differences between the natural and built environments in Chicago. It did so in a way that leaned slightly into materiality with the layered pages and translucent paper. Soon after, I began work on my Trapcat show, which was all about materiality and formal play that I felt was really indicative of my own personality and experiences as a female artist. For this show, I used a combination of yarn, string, and other fabrics on canvas, and I even experimented with plaster. After that show, all of my projects seemed to play more and more with different textures, processes, and materials, whether it be embroidering photos, wrapping rocks with string, or exploring the use of a photocopier. The results always surprised me, and it always made me want to keep creating. The generative results of this work were happening at a time that I was learning more about the idea of subcreation and the generativity and creativity that is a mandate for me because of my faith. I first encountered this idea in aesthetics through the reading of Dante and Heidegger, and the term subcreation specifically through the poem Mythopoeia by Tolkien. For those who aren't familiar with the term, here is a review of Tolkien's ideas from philosopher David Wiley. It stands to reason that because God himself enjoyed creating things, it is perfectly normal and natural to enjoy creating things. Tolkien termed this as subcreation because man cannot create something out of nothing like God, but rather can take things and form them into something new. Tolkien argued that humanity, while a fallen entity, still has a relationship with its creator, and that one aspect of the relationship is to emulate that creator in our own lesser acts of creation. The ability to create is our inheritance, and I believe we have not only a gift, but a responsibility to make art as worship and praise for our own creator who outfitted us with imagination. One of the best ways for me to do that reminds me of subcreation, or creating something that is a stand-in for and points toward the more full and perfect creative work of God the Father. We have an aesthetic responsibility to create, not only to perform imaginative and good work in praise of the one who created us, but to point towards the work of God. Encountering these ideas was such a turning point for me. For someone who has always struggled to see the connections between my faith and my desire to create art, this was so freeing. These beliefs drive my thesis work and are hopefully evident in the generative, personal feel of the project. All of these processes produce generativity and creativity, thus fulfilling our mandate. And each of these processes allowed me to co-create with my environment and subcreate with the one who created us. This work has reminded me that creating for the sake of creating is good, and it freed me from some of those paralyzing expectations and purposes that I had placed on my work. An artist that inspired me when I was creating this work is Sol LeWitt. LeWitt's work often relied on a set group of parameters, and once established, it's just about creating, often resulting in numerous permutations. That's how I often felt when making this work. Through experimentation, I would find a process that allowed me to interact with my environment and creation in a new way. And once I found that process, I followed those parameters and simply created. It was important for me to uphold these processes and go in without a plan for each individual study. I simply followed the parameters of the process, spent meditative time with each piece, and then followed intuitive rules of composition and color as I went. Matisse was another helpful guide. In a formal way, I have been and always am inspired by Matisse, which I think can be seen in the colors that I gravitate towards, as well as the organic and loosely abstract nature that my work has. Matisse was often inspired by elements of creation in his own work, but he was able to depict it in a way that was more abstract and playful and readily recognized as his own style. This abstract collaboration with nature is evident in my own work, which I hope has a likeness to my own personality and style as well. I will briefly touch on each individual process and how it helps me engage with creation in a new way. So I started with Xerox scanning flowers. This is a process I actually stumbled upon for a project last semester, and I found this process so interesting because the harsh light revealed the objects I was scanning in new and surprising ways, and I've been doing this process ever since. For this thesis work, I would make about a dozen iterations of each flower, rearranging them in new ways every time. Another thing that I appreciated about this process was that I couldn't see what the end result would be while I was working. I would make dozens and dozens of scans, but wouldn't actually know what the scans would look like until after I was done. It freed me to experiment with the composition, try to forget about careful planning, and get lost in the process. I began embroidering photos because I was interested in experimenting with the material surface of photos, and I thought photo and embroidery string would make a unique combination of materials. This created another meditative process that I really enjoyed, and one that I could spend time with and create endless iterations. Because this process made me spend a lot of time with the photo I was working with, I could appreciate the composition and lines in a different way. The photos that I chose for my thesis work are all glimpses into the environments I inhabit regularly, an appreciation of small moments in creation I find beautiful. While embroidering, I made sure to go in with a blank mind, working in a way that enhanced the lines already existing in the photo or following some instinctual sense of compositional play. I then found the process of creating gradients when I was making gradients that represented specific geographical locations, which at the time of this work was U.S. national parks. I found this process interesting because it focused solely on the different colors that are present in a space, and it abstractly represents a moment in time in a way that I could still find easily recognizable. For example, this gradient of Arches National Park really feels to me like the experience of being in that place. For then my thesis work, I then started creating gradients based off photos that I'd taken of spaces that I am often in. Here's an example of the photo that I used and then the gradient that I created from it side by side. To me, this gradient still feels like the experience that I had when taking this photo. Next, I began working on these paint pressings. These were created by dipping objects in paint and pressing them to my canvases in new ways. The objects that I used included rocks, flowers, leaves, grass, pine needles, and sticks that I'd collected. I was interested in the way that these paint shapes could be recognizable as the object itself, but it was also a beautiful abstract representation of them. I was also interested in the way that nature became my tools for art making through this process. These paint pressings then led me to continue a similar process exploration, but this time with plaster. I'd used Plaster for my Trapcat exhibition, which is an image that you see of here, and I found that it allowed me to create surprising textures for a more intense physicality in my work. I would start by making a base layer of plaster, and then I would press my tools down into the wet plaster, trying again to just follow instinctual compositional moves. Once again, my tools were elements of creation that I had found around me, and in some instances, flower petals or bits of grass would get stuck in the plaster, and I decided that I loved the way that those materials combined with the plaster, so I left it. For this next collaging process, I wanted to work with colored paper and fabric to continue adding different materials to this body of work. I began to make collages using found objects from nature as my guide for creating shapes. I would loosely trace a rock or a leaf or a stick and then cut out that shape and go from there. I really enjoyed the combination of different fabrics, some sheer, some opaque, and the different colors of paper. I tried my best to not worry so much about cutting perfectly or about the strings of fabric hanging down, and instead I used a loose Matisse style approach to the shapes. This last process is then the biggest surprise to me. I was drawn to the interesting natural materials that were piled in my studio from all of the other processes I'd been working on. There were rocks and leaves, some with paint or plaster on them from a previous process, and I wondered if I could make these objects, which had been my tools, into art itself. I began embroidering these objects to canvases in playful ways, and I found really interesting results. Embroidery is a thoughtful, time-consuming, and almost tender way of working that to me is really indicative of how I approach my artwork, as well as how I want to interact with my environments around me, so it was a really fitting process to finish this body of work with. I'll then end with a number of formal elements in this work that support my approaches. They include color and materiality, the presence of iterations, and the personal, organic elements included. The first two formal elements are texture and color, and they're two things that really drove how I selected each of these processes. These two formal qualities usher the viewer into a more visceral experience, and they were two ways that I myself could enter into observing my environments differently in creating this work. The processes I chose usually revolved around color or texture, so I tried to highlight how these qualities are present in creation in new ways. Even the textured linen-based paper that I created work on, or the choice to print on fabric for my larger pieces, is evidence of the importance of materiality to this work. The next formal quality describes how I made this work, but is also important in how it is displayed. Having multiple iterations of each of these processes was always a foundation of the work. If this work was going to be process-oriented, I knew I had to spend a lot of time with each process and create a lot of iterations. Displaying multiple iterations of each of these processes reveals to the viewer how process-driven the work is, and it emphasizes the generativity that drives the work. Finally, the handwritten elements are also a very important aspect of the project. They invite the viewer into the personal quality of the work, and the handwritten notations label each individual piece and underscore the very hands-on nature of this project. I hope it also invites other artists and viewers into a space that allows them to contemplate their own creative practices in art making, as well as guide them into considering the ways that they interact with their environments around them. Thank you.